As Frank White quoted Tom Wicker, columnist for the New York Times, "So must I," for it summarizes their protest. He says, 100,000 Muhammad Alis, of course, could be jailed, but if the Johnson administration had to prosecute 100,000 Americans in order to maintain its authority, its real power to pursue the Vietnamese War or any other policy would be destroyed. It would then be faced with not merely desertion, but with civil disobedience on a scale amounting to revolt. This is a student protest, not fanatical, but seemingly reasonable. In the July issue of Foreign Affairs, Irving Kristol, executive vice president of Basic Books and co-editor of a book, The Public Interest, and a magazine, The Encounter, was quite critical of the intellectual community, especially as it affected the Vietnam War. He said, "The intellectual community, en masse, disaffected from established power even as it tries to establish a power base of its own, feels no sense of responsibility. It denounces, it mocks, it vilifies, and even if one were to concede that its fierce indignation was justified by extraordinary ineptitude in high places, the fact remains that its activity is singularly unhelpful." The student population represented by the interviews of Frank White is by no means a vast majority, yet of those that object they turn to the same intellectual community in the United States for their answers. Kristol attacks this community, as do other critics. Now the community, or a representative of that intellectual community, should be heard from. I talked with Professor Noam Chomsky, professor of linguistics and instructor of political theory at MIT, in an interview which offers arguments to Kristol and support of a student protest. My first question was a quote from Kristol's article.
In a recent article in the Foreign Affairs by Mr. Irving Kristol, entitled "The American Intellectual and Foreign Policy," he quotes a recent letter to the New York Times complaining about the role of the academic community in opposing President Johnson's Vietnam policy, argued that it was not clear why people trained in mathematics, religion, geology, music, etc., believe their opinions in military and international problems should carry much validity. Certainly they, the professors, would oppose unqualified Pentagon generals telling them how to teach their course. Now, Kristol does not maintain that it is the intellectual competence or the intellectual validity that is important as far as what the intellectual's arguments actually are, rather a moral authority. Mr. Chomsky, can you tell me what your reactions are to such a statement, and tell us also how you feel concerning Kristol's argument?
I think the letter that Kristol quotes, which represents a position that he takes, entirely misses the point. It's quite true that professors would undoubtedly oppose unqualified Pentagon generals telling them how to teach their course, but I'm sure that those same generals would oppose professors telling generals what tactics to use in fighting a war. The issue, however, is not what tactics to use to fight the war. That, of course, should be left to the qualified Pentagon generals, but rather the issue is whether to fight the war. And that happens to be an issue concerning which the Pentagon generals have no particular qualifications. And it seems to me that this is the fundamental error, I think, in analysis that underlies Kristol's argument. He is quite happy to accept the kind, or to at least consider the sort of criticism which is based on tactical considerations, which says maybe we're not carrying out the policy in quite the correct way, or we should modify it here and there, and so on and so forth. But he's not willing to even face the fundamental question as to whether the policy is basically misdirected, for example, as to whether we ought to be fighting this war. So, for example, he's perfectly happy to consider the issue of a change in tactics, but not the issue of a change of policy.
Do you feel in and of yourself, as a representative of the intellectual community, that the intellectual in and of himself does have something to say and does have something to offer, say, contrary to Kristol's opinion, and of course the opinion of, say, other individuals that are represented in, current modern-day society?
I think some intellectuals have something to offer and others have nothing to offer, and I think that some government officials have something to offer and others have nothing to offer. The judgment as to on policy should be based not on an appeal to authority, either of intellectuals or of government officials, but rather should be based on the quality of the argument and the quality of the advice that they give. It seems to me that Kristol is trying to replace an appeal to argument and to reason and to fact. He's trying to replace this by an appeal to authority. And he's simply trying to discount in advance all opinions which do not fall within a narrow range that he circumscribes as legitimate. When somebody does replace an appeal to reason and to fact by an appeal to authority, I think one has a right to be very skeptical about the motives.
In quoting Kristol once again, he says, "No modern nation has ever constructed a foreign policy that was acceptable to its intellectuals. True, at moments of national peril or national exaltation, intellectuals will feel the same patriotic emotions as everybody else and will subscribe as enthusiastically to the common cause. But these moments pass and the process of disengagement begins, and it usually does not take long for a disengagement to eventually turn into alienation." How do you react to such a statement? Is the intellectual on the outside fringe looking in?
But there certainly have been periods, not just periods of national peril, when large numbers of intellectuals in the United States and similarly in many other countries have backed, right or wrong, have backed the foreign policy of their government. Just to take one recent example, the early years of the New Frontier, of the Kennedy administration, were a period in which a very large number of intellectuals became quite absorbed in affairs of government and in conduct of public affairs, and though they, at least if they had any integrity, criticized this and that, many of them felt a rather firm commitment to the general orientation of both foreign policy and domestic policy. At the moment, we happen to have a case where a large number, by no means every intellectual, but a large number of people in the intellectual and academic communities feel extremely disaffected and alienated. But this is not because they have some fundamental interest in opposing any policy that their government carries out, rather that they feel that the particular policies, specifically in Vietnam, are simply intolerable on many grounds. I think, again, by refusing to face this issue and by moving it to a level of extremely vague generality, Kristol is, in a sense, giving away his inability to construct an argument to back the policy that he wants everyone to accept. The question is whether it's realistic for a student to adopt and advocate a policy of unilateral withdrawal of the sort that I'm proposing, and that many others have proposed. I think it's very realistic. In fact, I think that this is the only realistic policy open to the United States in Vietnam, and hence the only realistic policy, the only policy that a concerned citizen, whether he be student or anyone else, should advocate. The reason why I think this is politically realistic is very simple. It seems to me quite unlikely that the Johnson administration will be willing to face the 1968 elections with an unwinnable war on its hands. It also makes no sense whatsoever for the government to extend the war to North Vietnam, or they'll simply have a twice as unwinnable war on their hands. Instead of having a war only against the rural population of South Vietnam, they'll also have a guerrilla war to fight against the population of North Vietnam, which of course won't improve the situation since they can't win the first guerrilla war at the present level of force. Therefore, I think that it's likely that there will be I don't think that pursuing the war along the lines on which it's now being pursued is politically feasible, because the Johnson administration will not, I suppose, will not be willing to face the 68 elections with this unresolved and apparently quite unresolvable situation. That means there are one of two things that they will have to do. One possibility would be for them to withdraw under whatever appropriate propaganda cover this could be developed, which is essentially a public relations matter. I mean, they can call it a victory. They can do anything they like. The second alternative would be to sharply escalate the war, perhaps to use tactical nuclear weapons, which might very well succeed in stilling the domestic opposition to the American occupation army, or perhaps increasing maybe they might, for example, think of trying to raise the level of the conflict to an international conflict, let's say to a confrontation with China. And I suppose with sufficient provocation, the Chinese would involve themselves. That might put the administration into a position which is politically feasible as far as internal domestic American politics are concerned, since no doubt the Johnson administration could win the elections if it was facing let's say a war with China was imminent or something of that sort, and it could appeal to the nation to back it in this very dangerous confrontation. But since of the various alternatives that can be imagined, one, namely continuing the war at the present level, seems unfeasible and unrealistic in terms of American domestic politics. It seems to me that basically the prospects are either for a very sharp and extremely dangerous and rather vicious escalation, or else for American disengagement and withdrawal in whatever terms it's couched. And since I don't see how any responsible American citizen can be either interested in destruction of Vietnam with, say, tactical nuclear weapons, or can be interested in a third world war, I would suggest that the politically realistic proposal that he should follow is one that permits us to disengage, to put an end to offensive military action, and to permit the establishment of a political entity in South Vietnam with enough of a political base so that it would have the local power and prestige to demand of us or ask us kindly to get out and leave them alone.
As Irving Kristol points out, once again referring to his article, American Intellectuals and Foreign Policy, he says that these arguments, your arguments in specific, are more on moral grounds rather than on actual, realistic social-political grounds. And therefore, also, I might interject, the student population also is objecting to this highly on moral grounds. Now, you've offered two solutions or two alternatives as far as withdrawal is concerned. They're obvious solutions. They seem realistic. They all operating under the basic assumption that victory is not possible. What other areas, what other appeals would you direct in confrontation with the student population, in particular, the university, the postgraduate individual? What other arguments would you offer to these individuals?
Well, I'd like to make it clear that I'm not proposing withdrawal because I think that victory is impossible. If victory were possible, I would still propose withdrawal because I think that an American victory over the Vietnamese people would be an international tragedy. And in this is one respect in which I would differ very sharply from many other critics of the administration. For example, Arthur Schlesinger, who's stated repeatedly, in particular in his book, The Bitter Heritage, that if an American military victory were attainable, then he would be in favor of the policies that we are now following. And in fact, he says that we would all be applauding the wisdom and statesmanship of our leaders if it turned out that they could succeed in obtaining a military victory along the lines that they're now following, which, as he admits, would turn the country into a land of wreck and ruin with its political and social fabric destroyed. I feel rather differently. It seems to me that if we could obtain a military victory by the means that we're now pursuing, or in fact by any means, that would be a tragedy for the Vietnamese people, since it would simply subjugate them once again either to a foreign authority or else to the most reactionary and corrupt elements in their own society, which we have insisted on imposing upon them as their government. Hence, I don't say that we should withdraw because victory is unobtainable. What I have said is something rather different, namely that since victory is probably unobtainable along the lines which are now being pursued, the prospects are for a very sharp escalation. And for this reason, it seems to me that a policy of American withdrawal is not only correct, as I think it would be whether or not victory was obtainable, but is also politically realistic. Very often a policy which is correct is not politically realistic, but in this case I think the policy is both correct and politically realistic.
I asked whether he agreed with Kristol's labeling of the intellectual community dissenters on moral grounds. He said,
I would essentially agree with him. I think that there is a kind of a moral issue there, namely the issue as to whether a great power has the right to ram down the throats of small people its conception of how they must live. And I think that basically that is a moral issue. Unfortunately, Kristol seems to believe, and I've noticed many other people who regard themselves as political realists also seem to believe, that they are not taking a moral position when they assume without argument that it is the right of the United States to force on other peoples any form of society that the United States chooses. But that's quite wrong. That is a moral judgment, I think a kind of an unspeakable and hideous moral judgment. But nevertheless, it's just as much of a moral judgment as the alternative, which I propose, which of course is not original with me, but is at least the more or less official position of the more or less official American ideology. So I think that I would like to take my stand on this case and on the official American ideology, which is a belief in the right of independence and of peoples large and small, rather than on the opposing position which Kristol, for example, advocates, namely that the United States has a kind of a basic and inherent right to impose its will by whatever means on anyone who's not strong enough to resist.
He responded to, do you find inconsistency among critics such as Arthur Schlesinger, Jr. and their approach in the following fashion?
Schlesinger's things quite carefully, and I think the position that he maintains is quite untenable. In fact, I think his position is really not very different than Kristol's. He also, the only real difference is that he, at the moment, is somewhat more sensitive than Kristol is to the vast human cost of the war that we're waging. But basically, Schlesinger does, it seems to me, accept the view that he accepts the high accord that Kristol grants to considerations of expediency. That is, Schlesinger does take the position openly that if the policy that we're pursuing can succeed, then he will certainly back it. His opposition is based on the fact that he doesn't think it can succeed. And I think you're quite right in saying that this is inconsistent with the ideological commitment that he would, I'm quite sure, adhere to, at least at a verbal level.
To the last question, what was the impact of the protest movement on American society? He responded,
as far as the impact of the war protest is concerned, it's extremely hard to judge. There's no way of knowing what the government would have done by now had there been no protest in the United States. I think it's perfectly possible that had it not been for the peace movement, the anti-war activities, that the level of hostilities carried out by the American forces might be very much higher. It might be, for example, that, let's say, tactical nuclear weapons would already have been used in South Vietnam and perhaps even in North Vietnam, although it's less relevant there, if it hadn't been that there was this upsurge of protest and dissatisfaction. And it may also be that, though one can't prove this, that the protest and anti-war activity is one of the factors that's stopping, that's at least preventing or delaying at least a provocation of China, which would maybe lead to an all-out attack on China, something which would be an incredible world tragedy and disaster, I think.
The Stop-It Committee and Professor Noam Chomsky of MIT. The topic, a student protest, an intellectual point of view. The answers to war are many. They may come from various sectors of a community, but the actual solutions seemingly few. This is because they must combine those various points of view, opposite and diverse from student, military, intellectual, and functionary sides or sectors of a community. This has been Vietnam War Report, and my name is Sanford Henry.